What is the role of women in the Orthodox Church? Actually, the answer is that it's the same as any layman, because most people in the Orthodox Church are not clergy. So women can do exactly the same things that men can do in the Orthodox Church, except be ordained. And there is a big problem today with the idea of that women are not valued if they're not holding ordained positions. Well, if that's true, then we're not valuing the men in the parish either. And that is not true. So the idea has come to us that women are not regarded as equal if they are not serving or allowed to serve in some kind of an official capacity with a certain kind of title. And that is not true, because the church recognizes that everybody has certain gifts. But from the time of the early church, men were set aside for the priesthood. And this does not, if we have the right attitude, this should not bother any woman. Now, why am I speaking about attitude? Well, our culture is telling us, sending us messages that there's something that the Orthodox Church looks down upon women because they're not allowed to be ordained, that somehow they're not considered equal to men. But that is an attitude of a person who is raised in a different culture and who is treating a position or a role in the world the same as the church. The church is not like the world. The church does not model itself after the world. The church does not decide what jobs people can do and give them titles and treat them as though they're an employee in the world. So we have to change our way of thinking when we approach this question. Women might say, but I want to serve the church. Well, guess what? Most of the things the priest does are not in the church. They're not during the divine liturgy. Most of the things a priest does is that first of all, there's a lot of administrative work in the office. There is ministry to homeless, to people who have drug addictions, to people who are depressed. There's all kinds of things that the priest does. They lead Bible studies, and they explain the faith to people. They visit people in their homes. They go to hospitals. Women and Orthodox women are doing already all of those things. They're iconographers, they're chanters, they're Bible professors, they're hospital chaplains, they are prison chaplains. All of these ministries are already being done by women. So the idea that people say, well, the church doesn't recognize the work that women are doing, first of all, we don't do it to be recognized. We don't do it to be given a title. And if that's what you feel that you need, there's something wrong with your attitude. Now, people probably won't accept that. But that's the difference between the Orthodox Christian mindset and the mindset of the world. So when the Lord said to the disciples spoke to them about leadership, he said, he who would be first among you, let him be the servant of all. So the priesthood is actually a life of service. Most people don't realize that. It's a life of real sacrificial service. It's really a martyrdom. Now, most people come to church on Sunday, they see the priest in his pretty robes, and he's up there presiding, and they're thinking, oh, he's honored by that position. No, he is representing us in that position. But most of the time, he's not in this position of prominence. He's in a position of service. And if you really want to serve the church, you will seek to serve and not to look for a position or title so that you can feel like you're important. The idea of insisting upon the priesthood for women, or even the female diaconate as it's being promoted right now, for the purpose of proving that the church values women, is a very worldly and unspiritual attitude that will actually corrupt the church. We don't want people to be serving the church because they want recognition, because they want people to say, oh, she's a deacon, she's a priest. That is not what the church is for or about. And that's not why men choose to become priests. They become priests to serve. And it is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week responsibility for souls. And so women who aspire to the priesthood are not thinking about that. They're thinking, I want to be that because the church is saying I can't be that. Well, that's not the reason to aspire to the priesthood. So I have some knowledge about this, being married to a priest for 45 years. This is not what people think it is. Now, one of the reasons why I think some people assume that the priesthood is a position of authority or power is because that's how it is in many Western churches. The priest or the pastor decides everything. That's not the case in Orthodoxy. It doesn't work like that. We have parish councils that have a significant amount of responsibility and say in what happens in the church. They don't take marching orders from the priest. If you think that by being a priest you're going to have some kind of authority, actually the priest has very little authority in the church. You see, the priest can only do, first of all, what the bishop allows. Most people don't know that. The priest can't even do a divine liturgy without the permission of the bishop. And so even if women were given the priesthood, what would they say next in Orthodoxy? Oh, that's not enough because we don't have any real authority. That belongs to the bishops. So now we have to be bishops. But even the bishops are limited. They can't do whatever they want. We have canons of the church. The bishops decide things together as a council, as a synod. So this idea of seeking some kind of validation by having a position is the wrong attitude, because it's an attitude of self-centeredness, of pride, and it's very worldly, and it is a corrupting attitude.
What would you say about those who have the idea that Christ had 12 male apostles only because the culture in which he lived 2,000 years ago was a male-dominated culture? This seems to be floating around outside,
It was true. It is true, first of all, especially in Judaism, that it was very strongly male-dominated. I don't believe that Jesus made that decision because he was afraid of what the culture would say. Because everything he did was countercultural. He touched lepers. He ate with tax collectors and sinners. And by the way, he had women disciples. And that was absolutely unheard of in those days. Women were not following rabbis. Rabbis didn't have female disciples. Only Jesus did. Jesus was, and Christianity was, the great liberator of women. He alone held women as equal to men, and they still are in the church. And here's why. Because in Judaism, there are different requirements for men and women. Women have certain roles, and men have other roles. Men are obligated under the laws of Judaism to say certain prayers and to do certain things, and women are not. Women are exempt from those things. Now, why are women exempt? You know what most of the rabbis said? Women are exempt. This is the conclusion that they came to because they were not allowed. So the exemptions, which may have had a certain practical purpose, and also this idea of women as being unclean in Judaism, that never existed in the church. We don't have this idea that women are not allowed to do certain things in the church. And instead, in the first century, we have women baptizing, women preaching, we have women healers, we have women doing virtually everything in the church, including women deacons for a very specific purpose. But we never had women presbyters or bishops. And I believe there's a reason for that. I could speculate about it, but I don't think my speculation matters. I think what matters is, as Orthodox Christians, we do what the early church did. We don't go beyond that. We assume that what Christ taught the apostles and the apostles taught for first Christians is what we are preserving. And even if we don't always understand something, that doesn't mean it's up to be negotiated or it ought to be changed. Sometimes we don't understand it, not because it was a cultural thing, but because there's a wisdom behind it that we, in our fallenness, in our brokenness, in our worldly thinking, do not understand. So instead of following our individual opinions about what we think the church should be like, We follow what Christ taught the apostles. And this has saved us so many times from making the kinds of mistakes that we see all these other churches making, where they don't even know what they believe anymore. There's so much corruption, there's so much loss. People are leaving those churches in droves because they're unrecognizable. We are still the ancient apostolic church, which we have not changed. And this is a precious thing. And once we begin to say, we'll just change this one little thing, we just want women priests, then the next person is going to say, well, we did that before. Why don't we change this? And why don't we change that? Why don't, before you know it, the church is unrecognizable. That's what happened already to the mainline Protestant churches. And it is happening to the Catholic Church, even though they don't have women priests yet. The Catholic Church accepted a lot of dramatic changes in the 1960s in a move toward modernization at a council that they had called Vatican II. And within a few years, people did not recognize their own church. And they've continued to change very, very dramatically and very drastically, to the great disturbance of many Catholics. So Orthodoxy stands for one thing. We preserve the apostolic faith. That's who we are. Maybe it's not for everybody. If it's not for you, find what you love and go do that and be that. But this is who we are. And as soon as we relinquish that and begin to follow other people's opinions, we will cease being the Orthodox faith. And that will be the end of things. But it's not going to happen because we know who we are. And if we don't understand something or don't agree in our own minds as if we are the arbiter of all things that are right or wrong, if we are so foolish as to think that and think that our wisdom is greater than the wisdom of the church, then if we're unwilling to change that, we are free not to participate in the Orthodox Church. But this is who we are, and we're not changing.
Could you speak also along the same lines about St. Paul? Mm-hmm. And for example, in his letter to the Ephesians, in this famous text where he writes about marriage, there seems to be some confusion about whether women are subject or submissive to their husbands, even though it says at the very beginning of this passage, husbands and wives be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And perhaps also speak about what was the meaning behind the covering, the veiling of women in the early church.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up St. Paul, because I was mentioning to you that, Father, that we were talking about, somebody was talking about women, that there are far fewer women joining the church than young men. And women are being told, they're being told that Christianity oppresses women and that they say that all women are subject to men. No, that's not true. Nowhere does the Bible say that. Nowhere did Jesus say that. It's quite the contrary. I already explained how in Judaism, women were subject to men. They had very few rights. They did not have equal responsibilities. They had a different level of spirituality. They weren't treated at all in the same way in Judaism, but that is not the case in the church. This is why St. Paul said there is neither male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free. The way you interact with Christ, your level of the possibilities for you of achieving sanctification in the church is exactly the same as a man. We don't distinguish. There aren't certain levels or rules for women to become saints versus men. There aren't certain special sacraments just for women and not for men. We don't have anything like that in the church, period. So some people will say, well, St. Paul said, I do not permit a woman to speak. Well, what did he mean by that? One of the things that we do in Orthodoxy is that we look to see what the fathers of the church said, not what my opinion is or what Joe Smith's opinion is down the road at some church where there are churches that tell women that they have to be submissive. And there are certain Protestant, I hate to call them even churches, cults that insist that all women must be subject to all men. I've had people tell me that they came out of churches like this. So that's not what St. Paul said.
That's abuse, a form of abuse, actually.
It really is.
It could be, yes.
It can be. But the point is, what St. Paul said, I do not allow a woman to speak in church, it is to carry on a conversation. We know that from the context, because as he continues, he says, if they have a question, let them ask their husband at home. So he's not talking about women preaching or chanting or reading the epistle in church. So, and one of the reasons why St. John Chrysostom comes to that conclusion, he's a master interpreter of the scriptures of all the fathers of the church, the greatest interpreter, is not only because of the context, let them ask their husband, but earlier in that same epistle, St. Paul tells women talks about women prophesying in the church and speaking in tongues in the church. So clearly, there was no blanket prohibition from women ever opening their mouths in church. And there's another passage in Timothy where he talks about that, the same thing, where he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authentia over a man. Now, that word is typically translated as authority, but it's not the word authority. But this is the verse that people point to, including many Orthodox men who are coming out of Protestantism because they don't know what Chrysostom says about it. The word, I do not permit a woman to have authentia over a man, is a special word of authority, and it was word that was used of kings and emperors and bishops. And Chrysostom actually says this does not allow a woman to teach as a bishop from the Vima. That was his interpretation, because he understood what the word meant. It doesn't mean that a woman can never have any authority over men. And in the life of the church, we have all kinds of examples of even women like Saint Nona teaching Gregory. The father of Gregory, the theologian, was a pagan, and he was instructed in the faith by his wife. We have so many examples of this. So it is ridiculous to suggest that women are second-class citizens or not equal or not respected as teachers or ministers or anything else in the Orthodox Church. That is not our tradition. So people should not confuse what's happened in Western Christianity because they don't understand the scriptures, because they don't have the mind of the early church. So let's talk about what it says in that epistle reading of the marriage ceremony. So St. Paul said, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So the important verse is not that women are just to submit to their husbands, but husbands are supposed to sacrifice everything, even their lives, for their wife. That's a higher calling, actually. Now, the fact is, in the Orthodox tradition, when we look at healthy marriages in Orthodoxy, it's not based on this silly Protestant simplification of that passage of the servant wife. I'm just supposed to say, yes, dear, you're the head of the house, you wear the pants, whatever you say goes, and just be submissive. That is not Orthodox, because that's not the early church. The early church and most healthy marriages don't function that way, with the husband making all the decisions, giving all the orders, and the wife carrying them out as if this is the army. That's not what it is about at all. And so what we see is that first verse is so important. Submit yourselves to one another. And in all marriages, we see wives saying to their husband, now you better listen to me and you go do this. You better go to the doctor. I'm tired of that cough that won't go away. You need to do this, and you need to go to this sports event for your child. And good husbands, smart husbands, will listen to their wives. And you have this wonderful interplay between husbands and wives. It's a mutual respect that they have for each other. That's an Orthodox marriage, and the Greeks have a great saying about that. The husband is the head of the house, but the wife is the neck that turns the head. Now, it is important to men to feel that they are the head of the house. This is a kind of a psychological thing. Men need to have that role, and Paul gives them that role. But when we talk about what is the level and how does that work, nobody can define that. But St. John Chrysostom said that men have a headship, but only in the slightest. The slightest. Not as lording it over the wife, not as dominating over the wife, but having a headship because somebody ultimately might have to be the head of the house. And we know, ladies, we know that this is important to men. So we let them have their headship and be the top dog or whatever, because that's important to them. And what's important to us is that they love and respect us, and that's how it works in most marriages.
Do you think that in this passage in Ephesians, the fact that St. Paul has to remind and exhort the husbands to love their wives, and he repeats it 4 times, but he doesn't have to tell the wife to love, because perhaps she doesn't need to be told. Is there something
That's
there?
that's an
perhaps?
interesting point, because it's not the wife. I think a natural. First of all, the reason why he gives the headship to the husband, I think, is because we naturally are the head of the house. I mean, in most families, it is the wife that really sets the tone in the home, that determines the agenda. I mean, I'll never forget this. I had to leave early when I was graduating from Harvard. I had to leave early for the commencement to go and get in line with everything. So I left home, and I left my husband in charge of our son to dress him. I said, okay, you're going to get Christopher dressed. He was a little guy, like 6 or 7 years old. He showed up with his pajama bottoms. My husband did not know. I said, don't you recognize these as his pajama bottoms? I mean, seriously, my husband didn't know how to dress our kid, let alone who the doctor was, who his dentist was, and all these other things. These are things that women have done because we care about these things. We're the ones who make the home beautiful. We're the ones who want to make the home a sanctuary. We really set the tone and run the home. If she was the head, what would happen to the husband? He would be relegated to a corner. So it's a way of balancing the relationship that St. Paul said that. I don't know that women need to be reminded to love. I think it's natural. But definitely, I think what Paul is getting at here is that when he speaks about loving your wives, when he gives them that headship, it is to remind them that it's a headship of sacrifice, not of authority, of ruling over and dominating the wife. And that if it happens in a marriage, as you mentioned, that's not only abusive, that's not a Christian marriage. Paul would never approve of that. You're not being more of a man or more of a Christian man by being domineering and dominating your wife.
Correct. Perhaps speak about this difficult or somewhat confusing passage in St. Paul. I think it's in his first letter to the Corinthians, about women veiling in relationship to angels.
Yes. This is one of the most mysterious and difficult passages to understand. I'm not sure that anybody really understands what he's referring to when he talks about the angels. First of all, in terms of women covering their head in church, this is a custom that is more prominent, let's say, in the Russian tradition, certainly than in the Greek tradition. I did not grow up with this custom. I don't cover my head in church. I think it's a beautiful custom if you feel called to it, but nobody should feel that that's obligatory. And no one should judge another person. Oh, this woman, she's not even covering her head. I had actually somebody on Facebook say she's practically naked because she was not covering her head. What are you talking about here? First of all, let's recognize there is a certain cultural element to that, because women didn't used to wear their hair down like this. This is a very modern thing. Until the 1920s, women always wore their head up. If you look at movies from the Edwardian era, from the prairies and all that, women are always wearing their head. They had long hair. They always wore it up. It's in the 1920s when women cut their hair. Those were the flappers, started wearing makeup. And ever since then, women wear their hair down. But the reason why they didn't wear it down is it was considered very sexy. It was prostitutes that wore their hair down to attract men. Let's face it, most men really like long hair on women, and they find it very attractive. And we know it. That's why we wear it down, and that's why we do it and curl it and do all these things to it. So we know that our hair is attractive to men. So this is why in antiquity, it's very easy to see. Go to any museum where they have statues of Roman statues, Greek statues. All of the women in the statues have their hair piled on their head. Now, in that passage where it talks about a woman, it doesn't say veiled, it says covered. Now, there's some discussion among scholars as to whether or not he means that they should wear a piece of cloth on top of their head, or whether they should wear it up, piled on top. A woman who covers her head by wearing her hair on top of her head, as opposed to loose. And there's a suggestion, and this may be true, that the women in Corinth were getting a bit carried away. They were speaking in tongues. There was a certain amount of ecstasy happening, and some of them may have literally let their hair down. And also, Paul is talking about how we have freedom in Christ. They may have simply let their hair down, and this gave the wrong impression. That passage is in a whole section, chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, where he talks about the proper behavior during worship. Not drinking too much wine before you come to church, not overeating, not, speaking all at the same time. He's talking about decorum and the proper behavior in worship. And so it has to be understood in that context. Now, when he talks about covering their heads for the sake of the angels, no one is really sure what that means. A lot of people will say this is because angels are tempted by women. And I say garbage. Absolute garbage. And by the way, on my upcoming podcast, I came across something that Chrysostom read, and I'm not actually talking about this, but Chrysostom talked about how ridiculous this is, because the angels see us at all moments of order. We come out of the shower, they see us at all moments. The angels are bodiless powers. They are not tempted by the flesh the way we are. Okay, that's not the reason. Now, what he meant because of the angels, I don't know. But that is a big question in biblical studies. And anybody who's confident in themselves, they know exactly what it means. I don't believe it. There might be something we might find later in some writing that relates to this that we don't know about right now. But he is thinking about it in terms of modesty. And because to wear your hair down was considered kind of the mark of a loose woman. So I think if women want to cover their heads in church, I think it's a beautiful tradition. I've thought about it. Somebody gave me a beautiful shawl, and I said, I might start praying at home with my head covered, just because, frankly, I think it's less distracting because you have something like this. You're less likely to be distracted. I might try it. And I might show up one day and start wearing a head covering in church. But the important thing is that we not judge others for wearing a head covering. Oh, she's like a super Orthodox. She thinks she's better than us. Or judge them because they're not wearing it. Oh, she's not really Orthodox. If she was, she's not pious. So it should be something, a personal preference, not a matter of judgment one way or the other. That's what I would say about it.
You touched just earlier about the role of the deaconess in the life of the early church, even up to the beginning of the 5th century, because we know that, speaking of St. John Chrysostom, his probably most beloved confidant was Olympia, who was a wealthy widow living in Constantinople, who was also a deaconess. So perhaps you could help us in this discussion that we're having currently about, well, if we're going to do this, what's the motive, which you brought up so very well, and then what should they be doing as part of this?
See, this is part of the problem, is beginning with the motivation. What is the motivation? The motivation for this current push for women deacons seems to be one thing: to make women more prominent, or to suggest that women have the right to some kind of ordained ministry. Now, the argument that's being made for this is that, first of all, women need women's gifts. I don't understand what that means. There's no such thing as a woman's gift. Whatever gifts we have, our spiritual gifts, those belong equally to men and women. So if you're going to say that women need deacons in order to minister to them, you're saying that the church has not effectively ministered to women for 2,000 years. Now, we know that women deacons were necessary in the early church because most converts were adults. Most people being baptized were adults, and they were baptized fully naked. And that job could not be done by a man, either a presbyter or a bishop. And not only were they baptized, were immersed, but they were covered in oil. So you couldn't have men touching the bodies of naked women. So this job was done by a female deacon. And they seem to have a special ministry to women, especially at baptism, and also women taking the Holy Sacrament to their houses, because when women were sick and couldn't come to church, it was considered improper for a man to go to a woman's bedroom, even to give her communion. So the deaconess would do that. This is something which, if you wanted to make the argument that we need female deacons to go to prisons or as hospital chaplains, I could actually see that, because I know that we have female chaplains in hospitals. They cannot give communion the way a male deacon would be able to give communion. You have to call the priest. Or to shut-ins. I could see that. But that's not really what people want. What they want is a woman to take a prominent position in the divine liturgy and function as a male deacon, saying again in peace let us pray to the Lord, to be giving out communion in the liturgy. We never did that. And in order to make that change, simply because we think it's a good idea, we want women to be featured more prominently, that will never satisfy the people who want it for the wrong reason. Because I mentioned before, the priest can do nothing without the bishop. The deacon does nothing without the priest. The deacon, a woman ordaining a woman as a deacon will not make her capable of hearing confessions. She can't do that. It won't make her a theologian. That doesn't make her a theologian. It doesn't mean she's capable of speaking to women as a counselor or psychologist or anything like that. She still has to be trained. We have plenty of women who do those things. So that really is a response to a sense by some women that the church does not value women because they don't have ordained positions. And as I said, that's a worldly attitude. It's the wrong reason to make women into deacons. And as soon as we start to change the church to appeal to people because of ideas that they have about the world, then we've lost the church, because the church will cease to be what we are, and that is faithful to apostolic tradition.
Very good. And just to finish up, speaking along these lines, what would you say would be the one thing, given that we're talking about what the church needs, what would be the one thing for our orthodoxy in America that would be at the top of your list and that needs addressing?
In terms of women?
In terms of the whole thing.
I think we need in America to be able to articulate who we are in a way that distinguishes us clearly from the Catholic Church and from what Protestants think we are. So Catholics believe we're exactly like them, except we don't have a pope. And that's what they tell each other. That's what they actually believe.
And
that
they
we
tell
are
us.
We're exactly like them. We have the same beliefs, except we don't recognize the pope. That is not true. Our mentality is completely different from the Catholic Church. Protestants, meanwhile, think we're just like the Catholics, and because we talk about tradition and we have ordained clergy. The Orthodox Church, the mind of the church, the way we think about life, about the church, about the sacraments, about sin and salvation, our whole psychology, our anthropology, the way we think about human beings and their relationship to God is completely different from both Catholics and Protestants. We need to start articulating that in a way that people can understand that Orthodoxy is different, rather than saying, well, we're like Catholics, we have sacraments, but we also don't have the Pope. If you give that answer as an Orthodox Christian, we're kind of like Catholics, you've lost everything. You have to be able to say, we are the original ancient church, and the way we think about salvation itself, the way we think about our relationship to God is completely different. Now, it can't be explained easily. And so this is when we have to say, come and see. Come to the church, read a little bit about Orthodoxy, and you will see how different it is. Because people are, I hear from people, Father, I'm sure you encounter people. I've had priests tell me that they are struggling. They have converts coming who are struggling with the idea of God being a vengeful God. If you can imagine, that still exists. There are Protestants who say God is a vengeful God and you're going to go to hell. And people coming to Orthodoxy, they've been hearing this kind of language their whole lives, and they have difficulty getting rid of this idea of God. And then we have people coming to Orthodoxy from the Catholic Church who are so rule oriented, who are so taught that you have to do this and this and this. You have this obligation, this obligation. They don't know what it is to be Orthodox and to have a sense of freedom. Not that everything goes, but that we don't focus on doing certain things in order to be saved. It's a whole different mentality. And so we need to be able to say that. And if people don't understand it, then they're going to have to come and learn slowly about it, and perhaps the light will come on.
Thank you, Dr. Jeanne. That
Thank
was
you,
wonderful.
Father.
Thank you so much.